the remote.
Ready?
Yeah. As the title of this picture indicates, in this third program on biblical archaeology, we're now going to travel with the Israelites on their exodus from Egypt to the Red Sea and search for the Red Sea crossing and Mount Sinai. There are several views on the route that Israel's journey involved from Egypt to Sinai, and therefore different views on the place at which they crossed the Red Sea and the site of Sinai itself. The long-held traditional view is indicated by the red line on this map. It depicts the area above the Gulf of Suez as the area where Israel crossed, that is across here. And it depicts Mount Sinai in the southeastern section of what tradition calls the Sinai Peninsula. There they are, I've got it, Mount Sinai down there. And so for that reason, they call all this the Sinai Peninsula. But there are several problems with this view. According to Exodus 14, verse 11, Israel was on her way out of Egypt when they got to the Red Sea. Exodus 13, verse 18 makes the same point, that their journey was taking them away from and out of Egypt. But if the Red Sea that they crossed was the Gulf of Suez, they'd still be in Egypt, not out of Egypt. And if God was taking Israel away from Egypt, he wouldn't take them down the peninsula parallel with the Gulf of Suez at all. He wouldn't be taking them all the way down there, because that was occupied and controlled by the Egyptians as it is today. In reality, what is called the Sinai Peninsula here was really the Egyptian Peninsula. And I'll call it that from now on to avoid confusion. Archaeology has confirmed this in the discovery of an ancient Egyptian temple in that peninsula, the ruins of which can be seen in this picture. The temple was dedicated to the goddess Hathor, and the ruins have yielded an almost complete series of hieroglyphic inscriptions from the 12th to the 26th dynasty, that is 2000 BC to 1200 BC. The Exodus took place in between this period, around about 1487 BC. Notable among those who adorned this temple was Queen Hatshepsut, believed to be the one who adopted Moses, and Pharaoh Thutmose III, who succeeded her and who was the Pharaoh when the Exodus took place. So this peninsula was clearly Egyptian territory, not the place to head for, to get out of and get away from Egypt. Also consider this. Exodus 13 verse 20 says it was after Israel left Egypt and was traveling in the wilderness towards the Red Sea that the Lord then led them by a pillar of fire during the night and a pillar of cloud during the day. But the Lord didn't lead the Israelites out of Egypt proper itself from the land of Goshen where they had lived. No, there was no need to. Moses knew the route out of there. He'd lived there all his life, and he'd gone out previously when he fled from Pharaoh to Arabia. And one thing is certain, Moses would not lead Israel to a dead end on the shore of the Egyptian Sea, that is the Gulf of Suez, when he knew there was a road around the sea, which he had followed previously, which led directly out of Egypt. Not only that, but there was no wilderness between the fertile land of Goshen and the Gulf of Suez. It's the Nile Delta region, and it is very fertile. Exodus 14 verse 3 says, Israel became entangled in the wilderness on her journey to the sea. That is, she became shut in, enclosed, that is, trapped by the mountains. How could this happen in the land of Egypt itself where they'd lived all their life and which they knew so well. Also consider this. According to the book of Exodus, when Moses fled from Pharaoh 40 years prior to the Exodus, he went to the land of Midian, and it was in that land that Mount Sinai was situated. According to most maps, the land of Midian was on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, as you can see on this map, not the Egyptian Peninsula. When Moses fled there, God told him he would deliver Israel from Egypt and bring them to Midian and Mount Sinai. Because Moses was fleeing from Pharaoh, he would take the main, direct, and quickest route, that is, the trade route to Ezion-Geber at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then down to Midian. This is a vital clue as to where the Red Sea crossing was. In order to find the Red Sea crossing and the true Sinai, we have to find the region of Midian. Moses' decision to hide in Midian was no doubt influenced by the presence of the Egyptian military in the Egyptian peninsula. With an army committed to his capture, Moses would want to get to Midian as quickly as possible, and he'd take the shortest and the quickest route, which was the main trade route. But the route that went parallel with the Gulf of Suez down around the Egyptian peninsula would be a very circuitous route and almost twice the distance. Now, as pointed out, most maps put the land of Midian in the Arabian Peninsula, which means Mount Sinai must have been in that peninsula, not the Egyptian peninsula. As you see on the screen, it's actually stated in Galatians 4, verse 25, that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Now, regarding the Red Sea, which Israel crossed, the words Yam Suf, which are translated Red Sea, occur 28 times in the Bible. None of them identify it with the Gulf of Suez on the Egyptian side. In Isaiah 11, verse 15, the Gulf of Suez, which is up here, that's the Gulf of Aqaba up there, of course. In Isaiah 11, verse 15, the Gulf of Suez is referred to as the Egyptian Sea, not the Red Sea. The Bible never refers to this stretch of water up here as the Red Sea. However, the Bible clearly identifies the Red Sea with the Gulf of Aqaba, which I pointed out is up here. For example, 1 Kings 9, verse 26 says Solomon's ships were at Ezion-Geber on the shore of the Red Sea. Ezion-Geber is at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. There it is, pointed out there. Furthermore, Exodus 22, verse 31 defines Israel's eastern border as the Red Sea. Now, under no stretch of the imagination can the Gulf of Suez be regarded as Israel's eastern boundary. It's south of Israel, not east. But the Gulf of Aqaba is clearly east. This is Israel, land of Israel, and here is the Gulf of Aqaba. It's east, but the Gulf of Suez is not east, it's south. Coming back to the Hebrew words Yam Suf, translated Red Sea, the word Suf, translated red, means reed and is related to papyrus reeds in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3 and 5. Because the papyrus reed grows in shallower parts of water, some have claimed that it was in a shallower marshland area in the Gulf of Suez that Israel crossed. However, the Hebrew word suf not only means reed in relation to papyrus reed, but also seaweed. It's actually translated weeds in Jonah chapter 2, verse 5. This verse in Jonah refers to seaweed wrapping itself around Jonah inside the belly of a large fish deep down at the bottom of the ocean. Gesenius's lexicon says Red Sea means sea of weeds or the weedy sea. And he points out that the Arabian Gulf of Aqaba abounds in seaweed. According to the Bible, the sea that Israel crossed was a great deep involving mighty waters of such depth to completely overwhelm and submerge Pharaoh's horses and chariots. Exodus 15, verse 5 and 8, Psalm 106, verse 9, Isaiah 51, verse 10, Isaiah 63, verse 13 are verses which state that. Exodus 14, verse 22 and chapter 15, verse 8 say that the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left hand due to being congealed by God. Such descriptions cannot be applied to a shallow marshland in the Gulf of Suez, but it certainly applies to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is extremely deep. If it was emptied out, it would look like the Grand Canyon, only much wider. Now, in view of the fact that God told Moses to bring Israel back to the land of Midian, where he had fled previously from Pharaoh, he would naturally follow the same trade route to Ezion-Geber, then down around the Red Sea into Arabia. That's it there. The main trade route, Ezion-Geber, is up there, as I pointed out before. However, Exodus 14, verse 2 says that at a certain point along this route, before they reached Ezion-Geber, which is Elot in this map, the Lord told them to turn off that route. This resulted in them ending up on the shore of the Red Sea. Now, there's only one place on that route where you can turn off and go down to the sea, and it's indicated on this map. It's about there. It comes off there and goes down to the Red Sea. In this picture, the journey from Egypt to the Red Sea is superimposed on a map. According to Josephus, it took 3 weeks. Exodus 16, verse 1 is consistent with this because it states that it took 4 weeks to get to the wilderness of Sin on the Arabian side of the Gulf. Those exploring the region found the place where you can turn off and go down to the Red Sea, and you're looking at it here. Jeremiah 2, verse 6 says, Israel was led, quote, where no one travels or lives. This is an apt description of being directed off the main road to the western shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. At the turnoff, the road leads through a wadi, that's a dry riverbed, by the name of Water. It's a wide and wild mountain gorge through which a road now runs and through which pilgrims walk. It involves a winding maze of riverbeds in a twisted path nearly 30 kilometers, about 18 miles long, to the shore of the Red Sea. In this canyon, Israel was hemmed in between walls of rock 600 meters, about 2,000 feet high. This ties in with Pharaoh's reaction when he heard where they were heading. He said, quote, they are entangled in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. There's no place that fits this description in the Nile Delta where the old traditional view believes that the Israelites were led. As you can see here, the wadi leads to the sea. When the Israelites saw the sea in the distance, they would realize they were heading for a dead end. The wadi leads out onto a wide expanse of beach, which can be seen in this satellite picture. See that little white blob there? It's known today as Nuweiba. No other place in the peninsula fits the geographical specification of Exodus 14 like this particular location. This picture shows the beach and the winding, twisting wadi that leads to it with its high, rugged cliffs on each side. The gorge is dry most of the time, but when it rains, it pours, causing a flood to flow down the canyon, and it washes all the sand from the wilderness out onto the beach and then out into the sea. The beach is 7 kilometres, about 4.5 miles long, and just over 5 kilometres, about 3.5 miles wide, and could accommodate the estimated 2 million Israelites. The beach is the result of thousands of years of flash floods, sending enormous volumes of sand out into the Gulf. Water can actually be seen flowing out in this picture. Notice how the beach is nestled among the mountains. The mountains go right down to the sea. The Israelites appeared to be, as Pharaoh said, shut in, trapped at a dead end. Exodus 14 says, Pharaoh and all his army of horses and chariots raced through the wilderness and turned down the wadi leading to the beach where Israel was encamped. Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century AD, refers to this, and he makes some interesting comments. Quote, now when the Egyptians had overtaken the Hebrews, they seized on the passages, that's the wadis, by which they imagined the Hebrews might escape, shutting them up between inaccessible precipices and the sea, for there was on each side a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness or ruggedness and obstructed their escape. This description by Josephus fits Nuweiba Beach perfectly. It doesn't fit anywhere else on the Gulf of Suez. Pharaoh's army would have entered the same wadi that Israel traveled down because, as I've said, it was the only entrance to the beach. The Israelites were sitting ducks, hemmed in with no escape route and expected to get massacred. At this point, Moses said, fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. At that point, the pillar of cloud moved behind them and stood at the entrance to the beach between the Israelites and the Egyptian army, preventing the Egyptian army from actually entering the beach. When night came, the pillar of smoke became a pillar of fire and was stationed in the same position. During the whole night, the Egyptian army was stacked up through the wadi in darkness, but the pillar of fire gave light to Israel on the beach. In this picture, we're looking across the Gulf in the area where Israel was encamped. It's about 16 kilometers, 10 miles across the Gulf, and the last thing that Israel would have been expecting was to be walking across there. Exodus 14 verse 21 says, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. This caused the water to divide. Now, only a mega hurricane force supernatural wind would be able to do that. Exodus 14 verse 22 says, there was a wall of water on both sides of the Israelites as they walked through. The wind didn't keep blowing, of course. Exodus 15 verse 8 says, God congealed the water. That is, he set it firm and solid in its divided position, possibly by freezing it solid. I don't think he used jelly crystals. Exodus 14 verse 23 on tells us that Pharaoh and his army went in after the Israelites, but the chariot wheels got clogged and many were wrenched off their wheels. Moses was then told by God to stretch forth his rod, resulting in the sea crashing down upon the Egyptian army and drowning them all. Now, in the shallow part of the sea, in the southern area of Nuweiba Beach, This Phoenician-style granite column was found in 1978. When the authorities were notified, they shifted it to higher ground. They set it in concrete, as you see here. The actual position of the column on the beach is indicated here, up here. It's almost 6 meters, about 20 feet high, and originally had inscriptions on it, but they had either eroded away or had been chiseled off by somebody. But a matching column was found on the opposite side of the Gulf, on the Arabian shore, where there is also a large beach area, and it was made of the same granite, obviously made by the same person. When the Arabian authorities were notified and became aware of the outside interest being focused on that part of their country, they came along and removed it to an unknown location, and this flag marks the site today. On the satellite map, the positions of the two pillars on each side of the Gulf are indicated by the arrows. One here and one there. That was the route. Inscriptions in the ancient Hebrew script were still intact on the column on the Arabian side, and it was deduced from them that it was set up by Solomon, king of Israel, in honor of Yahweh, the God of Israel, commemorating the crossing of the sea and victory over Pharaoh. These are the words of the inscription that could be deciphered. Mizraim, which is a Hebrew word for Egypt; Solomon, who was the king of Israel; Edom, the Edomites lived in Midian at the time; death, Pharaoh; Moses, Yahweh. It's significant that the commemorative columns were of Phoenician style, because it was in fact a Phoenician who made the columns for Solomon's temple. And according to 1 Kings chapter 9, Solomon had an alliance with the Phoenicians, which involved joint sailing ventures with Israel up and down the Gulf of Aqaba, past the very sites where the columns were found. It would not, therefore, be unusual for commemorative columns to be made at Solomon's request and to be placed at the departure and exit points of the Red Sea crossing. In view of the discovery, the strip of water across the Gulf between the two columns became very significant. Diving teams have done underwater investigation and have found, as British Admiralty charts show, that the shoreline drops steeply into the deep trench or canyon of the Gulf. In view of this, the question is, when the water was divided, how did the Israelites get down the steep, precipitous cliffs of the canyon of the Gulf in order to walk across and climb up the other side? Well, diving teams claim that there's a gentle slope from the beach at Nuweiba down into the sea and up to the Arabian beach on the other side. These slopes may have been natural sloping areas in the sides of the deep Gulf Trench and increased by the millions of cubic meters of sand washed down into the sea from the gorges on both sides of the Gulf over the millenniums, forming a sort of bridge. Isaiah 43 verse 16 says, God made a way, that is a road through the sea, a path through the mighty waters. This could be taken literally in relation to an underwater ridge, and it would not be hard to see the providential hand of God behind it. This picture is interesting because it's taken along the area of the Nuweiba beach from which the path led across to the Arabian shore. In this area, the sand and stones have been literally melted together into a solid mass like concrete. It's believed that the heat of the pillar of fire, which hurled back the Egyptians, melted the beach here, fusing the sand and stones together. There really is no other explanation for this. Now, Exodus 14 says Pharaoh's army, involving horses and chariots, pursued Israel across the Gulf, but the sea came crashing down upon them, and it's natural to wonder if some trace of this would be left behind on the seabed. Now, the thing about the Gulf of Aqaba is that it's an area where coral grows bountifully if it has something to latch onto. But the seabed at Nuweiba is sandy, and coral does not grow on sand. Coral needs a solid object on which to grow. So coral pots swimming around are always looking for something on which they can latch themselves. Though coral can complicate the search for objects, it can also be instrumental in preserving the shapes of objects, for sometimes it conforms to the very shape of the object. The coral consumes the wood or consumable material, but preserves the shape of the object. So then, if chariots were dumped in the sea and churned up as the full force and weight of the sea came crashing down on them, causing their wheels to come off, as is stated in Exodus 14, verse 25, you could imagine the seabed being strewn with chariot parts. Egyptian chariots were made mainly out of wood, but did have metal fittings. They had metal hubs and metal fittings at the joints. And it would only be a matter of time before coral pots floating around would latch on to all the bits and pieces strewn on the seafloor, resulting in outcrops of coral scattered all over the floor. And this is what was discovered on the seabed between Nuweiba Beach and the Arabian shore. There are outcrops of coral all over the place in weird, unusual shapes, some resembling the shape of chariot wheels, like this one, which is not difficult to discern the shape of a wheel, and hub minus its axle, one of the many that came off a chariot as it was demolished by the crashing waves of the sea. Some wheels were off their axles, confirming Exodus 14, verse 24, which says the wheels did come off, and others were still on their axles, as you see here. One distinctive type of formation often seen on the seafloor is this slender table-like structure, sometimes standing on end. It has a coral-encrusted base, a straight shaft, and a circular top. It's a 90-degree angle, that is a right angle between something that looks like an axle and a wheel. Wheels and an axle have been superimposed in this picture to suggest what the object originally looked like. When a metal detector was run over these coral formations, traces of metal could actually be detected in them. When coral was opened up, rust stains were found inside, indicating that something metallic was definitely originally buried there. Divers and explorers from 3 continents have, in turn, explored the Nuweiba area of the Gulf. They've compared the distribution of coral here to a junkyard and an aftermath of a disaster, which would be a fitting description for the graveyard of Pharaoh's chariots. Many of the strange formations display features indicative of human engineering, involving circular shapes, 90-degree angles, indicative of wheels and hubs. One investigator said, quote, "This is not a coral reef, but a coral yard of artifacts." While most of the artifacts found were covered in coral, one significant discovery was not, namely this gilded wheel. It was originally a wooden wheel with a gold veneer or electron, that is a mixture of silver and gold. The wooden frame inside the gold veneer had long since dissolved away, but the gold had been well preserved and the shape is clearly seen because coral will not attach itself to or grow on gold. It was too brittle or fragile to handle or remove. It would have broken up if removal had been attempted, so it was photographed and tagged and left on the seafloor. The gold-plated wheel may have come from a chariot similar to this gold-plated one that was found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The gold-plated wheel in the Red Sea was on the western side, indicating it was at the rear of Pharaoh's army. It may have belonged to the chariot of a young prince or a priest, not trained or involved in the battle. Remnants of both 4-spoke and 6-spoke wheels have been found by divers in the Red Sea. And the design and dimensions of these wheels match what has been found in Egyptian tomb paintings and temple carvings dating back to the time of the pharaohs. Many ancient Egyptian reliefs could be shown of chariots with 4-spoke and 6-spoke wheels, demonstrating that the chariot wheels found in the Red Sea were consistent with the design and size of wheels on Egyptian chariots. On the right of this picture is a human femur, thigh bone, taken from inside one of the coral formations. On the left is one unearthed from a tomb. Bone is basically made of calcium, and coral is also calcium. In this case, the coral had grown into the bone and replaced it. So the bone had basically been fossilized. Coralized is the technical term. And this is a coral-encrusted rib cage, which once belonged to one of the Egyptian soldiers drowned in the Red Sea. And finally, a coral-encrusted hip bone. Most of the bodies of the Egyptian army would have actually floated away. In fact, Exodus 14 verse 30 says the Israelites saw their dead bodies washed up on the shore, that is, on the Arabian side of the sea, but bodies would also have washed up on the other side as well. But some bodies obviously got trapped in or under their chariots in the sea, leaving bodily parts in the sea to get coralized, as we have seen. Well, the sun was truly setting over Egypt as far as Israel was concerned. They never saw the Egyptians again. They were truly out of Egyptian territory and heading for Sinai in Arabia. In this picture, we're on the Arabian side of the Red Sea, looking across the sea to Nuweiba beach. The beach on the Arabian side leads inland through a wadi or canyon through which the Israelites journeyed, heading for Sinai. Exodus 15 tells us that Israel headed for Mount Sinai and came to a place called Marah, where there was water, but it was too bitter to drink. There is such a place on that route where the water is so repulsive that 4 hours later, you can still taste the bitterness in your mouth. The Israelites moved on and encamped at Elim. And Exodus 15 verse 27 says there were 70 palm trees and 12 wells of water there. Less than 50 kilometers, about 30 miles from the Red Sea, there is an oasis matching this description. 12 springs are still there, bubbling up out of the ground. Exodus 16 tells us that on their way to Sinai, the Lord caused the wind to blow flocks of quail into the camp to satisfy their craving for meat. Back in the 19th century, due to lack of information on the subject of bird migrations, some rejected the reference to flocks of quail flying in that particular region. But today, we're better informed. It's now known that quails, together with other birds, do fly across the Red Sea. As Israel journeyed on in the wilderness towards Mount Sinai, they came to a place called Rephidim, and it says there was no water there to drink. Moses was told by God to smite a rock with his rod, and water would gush forth. Psalm 78 says, water came gushing out like a river, causing gullies to overflow. This particular episode has been a target of the skeptics, but it really needn't be. There are many places on the planet where water gushes out from rock. If geologists are able to direct drilling operations to the right spot for water or even oil, then so can the one who created the rock strata in the first place. Exodus 17 says that while Israel was at Rephidim, the Amalekites, that's the descendants of Edom, attacked them. But Israel defeated them, and Moses built an altar there. On the screen are the remains of an ancient stone altar found by explorers as they followed the trail to Sinai, and it is believed they are, in fact, the very remnants of that altar that Moses built. It's made of hewn, that's undressed stones, which is how altars were to be made according to Israel's law. It was in the same area of the altar that Moses struck the rock to release water, and explorers found in the same locality a mound which rises 35 meters, about 110 feet high, on the top of which is a split rock, as you see here. The rock is about 15 meters, about 50 feet high. Of particular significance was the fact that there was evidence of large volumes of water having flowed from this rock in the past. At the base of the split, there are gouges and the rock is worn smooth, displaying the pattern of water erosion, a rare sight in an area that usually receives less than 3 centimeters, about 1 inch of annual rainfall. The walls on the inside of the split rock are quite smooth also, indicating that water erupted out of the rock under considerable pressure with such force as to smooth the sides of the rock. Following the trail further in, about 32 kilometers, about 20 miles from Rephidim, the explorers arrived at what they believed to be the true Mount Sinai, a mountain with a blackened peak that you see here. A steep peak, 2,600 meters, about 8,228 feet high, the highest mountain in the entire region. This map shows the position of Mount Sinai and outlines the whole journey from Egypt via the crossing of the Red Sea. It's actually only 40-odd kilometers as the crow flies from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. Identifying this mountain as Mount Sinai is consistent with the most specific description of the mountain's location given by the 1st century historian Josephus, who wrote these words. He said, "It was the highest of mountains near the city of Madian." Now, Madian was identified in the Arabian Peninsula by the Greek geographer Ptolemy and is indicated by the black arrow on this map. The mountain is presently named Jebel el-Lawz, which means mountain of God's law. The Arabian Bedouin call it Jebel Musa, which means mountain of Moses. There's a strong tradition among them that Moses had been there. The top section of the mountain is black, as if it had been scorched or charred by an inferno involving tremendous heat. It looks like it's made of coal. This is evident looking at the top section of it as you are here. This feature is consistent with the biblical record, which says God descended on the mountain in fire, causing it to be burnt and to smoke. None of the other many mountains surrounding this mountain have a burnt-looking black top like this. All the others are reddish, brownish all over. Some have suggested that they are vulcanized rocks that came out of a volcanic eruption. But when the black rocks were turned over or broken open, they were only black on the outside or underside and pinkish brown inside, revealing they were not volcanic. Now we read in 1 Kings 19 verse 9 that Elijah, who lived centuries after Moses, journeyed to Mount Sinai and went into a cave up there. To be the true Mount Sinai, there'd have to be a cave up this mountain. And sure enough, there is. As you can see, it's about 6 meters, 20 feet deep, and about 4.5 meters, about 15 feet high. Two items in particular in connection with the mountain are of interest: the altar at the foot of the mountain and an altar with calf inscriptions on it further out from the base of the mountain, which we will look at first. It's a large pile of rocks with a flat top, giving the appearance of being man-made. It would have required a lot of manpower to set up, but Israel wasn't short of men. Exodus 12 verse 37 refers to 600,000 men in the camp. The pile of rocks didn't just grow there. Why would the Saudis put a security fence around a mere random rock pile? The significance is indicated by the fact that etched into some of the stones are 12 inscriptions of cattle and bulls, which are both biblical and historical significance. The distinctive horns in some of these petroglyphs, that's rock carvings, resemble those found in the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt, of the sacred Egyptian bull god Apis, such as you see here. It seems to be a reasonable assumption that the pile of rocks had been used for the Egyptian type worship. But Arabia was never Egyptian territory, and no such carvings as those found on the piles of stones have ever been found anywhere else in Arabia. So how come an Egyptian altar was here? This was regarded as a major discovery because Exodus 32 tells us that while Moses was away up the mount, the Israelites made a golden bull calf and built an altar on which they offered sacrifices to the Egyptian god. The calf idol was clearly the result of Egyptian influence during the centuries that the Israelites sojourned in Israel, in Egypt. As you would expect, paintings and reliefs of bulls and calves representing the Egyptian god Apis appear on the walls of Egypt's ancient temples and tombs, and many could be shown like this one. The position of the other altar at the foot of the mountain is indicated by the yellow circuit in this picture. It's clearly a man-made, angular-shaped structure. It's believed that it was in this area of the mountain when Moses had previously fled from Pharaoh that an angel spoke to Moses in what appeared to be a flaming bush. This picture of the altar was taken from the other side, from up the mountain. And there's a similar picture from another angle showing the angular shape of the altar. The discovery of ash in the soil of the structure indicates it was originally an altar built and used for offering animal sacrifices. Being at the foot of the mountain is significant in view of the fact that we read in Exodus 24, verse 4, that Moses built an altar at the foot of the mountain, as well as set up 12 stone pillars. Regarding the stone pillars, remnants of pillars were found at the Sinai site, as you see here. Originally, they would have been stacked on top of one another. This was the style of pillar formation used by the Egyptians and other nations. According to this tape measure, these sections of pillars were 60 centimetres, about 24 inches in diameter. However, some believe that these were not remnants of the 12 pillars set up by Moses, but remnants of a memorial set up later by Solomon, as in the case of the pillars set up on each side of the Red Sea. And I must admit, I tend towards that view. Among the rock inscriptions found in the area was this Jewish menorah, an image of a 7-branch lampstand that was kept in the tabernacle. It's the oldest image of the menorah ever found, showing the Jewish roots of the other inscriptions and items that were found in that area. In Exodus 19, verse 12, Moses was told to set bounds, that's boundary markers, around the base of the mountain to warn the people not to go any closer. And explorers have found the evidence of boundary markers buried in a ridge of dirt with only their tops showing. Some have been superimposed in this picture and are now behind the security fence seen in the foreground. This diagram shows how the columns were constructed, not out of one solid piece of rock, but of many pieces. Now, why would anybody put these rock piles in precise linear fashion at the base of the mountain? Only by allowing the Exodus account in the Bible to explain it can any real sense be made of it. This diagram shows the features that we've been looking at: the darkened top, the cave, the altar at the base, the altar with carvings of bulls, the 12 pillars, and the boundary markers. In relation to these features, one explorer said this, quote, "If I was a district attorney, I would certainly prosecute this mountain as being Mount Sinai." While Israel was at Sinai, Moses was told to build a tabernacle, and the structure had to be built out of wood from acacia trees. We read that in Exodus 25, verse 10. The reference to the acacia tree in the wilderness of Sinai is just another one of those undesigned coincidences which contributes towards the authentication of the biblical record. As in the case of flocks of quail coming into the region, the same applies to acacia trees being in the region. If they were never seen, that is, if these trees were never seen in the region and would not survive in that area, the authenticity of the biblical record would, of course, be questionable. However, the acacia is indigenous to the Sinai region and is the most common of the desert trees. Almond trees have also been found, which is interesting in relation to a reference to Aaron's rod being an almond branch. The Bible's reference to history, geography, topography, birds, animals, fish, trees, metals, fabrics, etc., are always consistent with the facts of nature. Things are not put into wrong locations or wrong time slots and epochs. Harmony and consistency prevails throughout the whole biblical record. Near the base of the mountain are also the remains of some type of shrine there. It was built of pure white polished marble, according to local Bedouin, but had been dismantled and used in a mosque in Haggai. As in the case of the sections of columns seen earlier, it has been conjectured that the shrine may have been set up by Solomon as a memorial, as in the case of the columns set up on each side of the Red Sea. After the Sinai discoveries were made and shown to a Saudi archaeologist in 1985, a guardhouse was set up at the base of the mount, which you see in this picture here. And a security fence, 3.7 meters, about 12 feet high, was erected around the mount. This indicates how seriously the Saudis take the site. The sign erected there in Arabic and English says, quote, "Archaeological area, warning, it is unlawful to trespass. Violators are subject to penalties stipulated in the antiquities legislation passed by royal decree." Saudi gunboats regularly patrol their side of the Gulf to keep intruders out. So they jealously guard the site and they banned all books and movies of it in their country. They arrested and imprisoned the original explorers, accusing them of being spies, and they confiscated their films. They clearly do not want the discovery to be publicized, and it has therefore been difficult to film the site, and what we have seen was smuggled in, some of what it has been, and that's why some of it's a bit blurry. The historical connection between Sinai and Israel and worldwide Muslim animosity towards Israel may have something to do with the Saudis' lockdown of Sinai. Many, of course, have been accustomed to believing that another mountain, now seen on the screen, is the real Mount Sinai. It's on the Egyptian peninsula, and some are not eager to change that tradition, even though not a scrap of archaeological evidence has ever been found there to prove it. That's St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of it. It truly is amazing to consider that the true Mount Sinai has been sitting in Arabia for centuries, unknown, untouched, unspoiled by the streams of artifact-seeking tourists and pilgrims who would have by now probably taken away most of the mementos of the past, stripping the site of its evidence. Due to the remoteness and dry desert conditions of the Arabian mountains, the relics of the Exodus have been preserved and remain exactly where they were left by the Israelites. The few Bedouin in the area have not vandalized or removed them. Maybe divine providence has kept them from discovery and looting till more recent times for the benefit of an increasingly skeptical world. After spending almost a year at Sinai, Israel moved on through the wilderness, heading for Canaan, the promised land. They went up through Ezion Geber, then they went up to Kadesh Barnea, showing the trip, Kadesh Barnea there. But due to a negative response to the prospect of going into Canaan and doing battle with the Canaanites, Israel was forced to remain in the wilderness of Zin for 40 years. During the last leg of their journey, both Aaron and Moses died, leaving Joshua to lead the nation into the promised land. Moses died at Nebo, which you see here. Aaron died earlier at Mount Hor, which was further south of Nebo. Prior to crossing the River Jordan into the promised land, Israel encamped at Abel Shittim in a plain near the river. You see Abel Shittim here. Israel was told the River Jordan would stop flowing in order for them to be able to cross over into the land of Canaan. Joshua 3 verse 16 says, the river dammed up further upstream, causing the water to stop flowing, enabling them to cross over. Some have been skeptical about this, but it has happened since, not only to the River Jordan, but to many other rivers on the planet. Arab records mentioned a similar occurrence in 1267 AD, in 1906, and in 1924. The flow of the Jordan stopped for 24 hours due to a landslide caused by an earthquake. Some have therefore attributed the damming of the river to natural forces, not supernatural. But the point is overlooked that Israel was told the precise time that the river would stop flowing and to be ready to walk across. Even today, seismologists with their modern equipment cannot predict the precise time of an earthquake and a cave-in and have everybody standing by ready and waiting for it. So then, Joshua led Israel across the dry bed of the River Jordan and embarked upon crusades to conquer the Canaanites and to take possession of the land, involving many battles. In more recent times, Israel's past occupation of Palestine has been disputed. Some think there's no physical evidence to prove it. However, there are volumes of archaeological evidence which prove it beyond doubt, and I want to conclude this program by just giving a few examples. This victory still of Pharaoh Meneptah, who reigned around 1200 BC, gives an account of his victories and includes a victory in Canaan over Israel. It says Israel is devastated. It was discovered at Thebes in 1896. It's housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It provides proof positive that Israel occupied Canaan by at least the 13th century BC. It is therefore commonly known as the Israel Stele. In 1994, this stone slab was found on a mound in northern Israel known as Tel Dan. An inscription was found on the stone which read, "The house of David and the king of Israel." It was written in the Hebrew script of the 9th century BC. The inscription confirmed that Israel existed in the land and that David was king and had a dynasty referred to as house around 1000 BC. Pharaoh Shishak's victory relief, seen here on a temple wall at Thebes, also confirms Israel's occupation of Canaan. He reigned from 945 to 920 BC, and his relief records how he invaded Israel, plundered treasure from the temple at Jerusalem, and took captives from cities in Israel. This is a drawing of the relief. It depicts 10 lines involving 156 of Israel's towns and localities, which are all named, again confirming Israel's occupation of the land at that time, nearly 1000 BC. In this close-up, you can see the 156 towns and localities depicted as people attached to by cords to Pharaoh, and their names are inscribed on their body, which is in the shape of a tablet or a cartouche with serrated edges. This black obelisk was commissioned by the ancient Assyrian king Shalmaneser, who reigned from 859 to 824 BC. It was discovered in 1846 in Nimrud, Iraq. It's inscribed with many inscriptions and scenes commemorating the victories and deeds of the king. One of the scenes on the obelisk refers to Israel in her land, which he invaded, and actually mentions by name the king of Israel who was reigning at the time, namely Jehu. Not only that, but this carving on one of the panels depicts Jehu on his knees offering tribute to the king of Assyria. The inscription on the obelisk reveals this. This confirms references in the Bible to both Shalmaneser and Jehu. Jehu is mentioned by name about 60 times in the Bible, and Shalmaneser twice by name, and other times as the king of Assyria. This is the Moabite Stone, discovered in 1868 at Dibon in Jordan, which was occupied in biblical times by the Moabites. It's in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it's inscribed with a record of the rebellion of Mesha, the king of Moab, against the king of Israel. This is a printout of the inscription. Moab had been in subjection to Omri, king of Israel, but rebelled during the reign of their king Mesha around 840 BC. This piece of history is referred to in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3. Reference on the stone to the king of Israel by name and Israel's God Yahweh by name confirms again Israel's occupation of the land under a king at that time in 840 BC. This six-sided hexagonal prism was unearthed in 1830 at the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh, situated in Iraq today. It's now in the British Museum. It records the triumphs of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who reigned around 700 BC. On the prism, he refers to the Jews in the land of Canaan and mentions their king Hezekiah by name. This confirms references in the Bible to Sennacherib, who invaded Israel, confirming that Israel occupied the land in 700 BC and was ruled by a king named Hezekiah, who reigned from Jerusalem. According to the Bible, 2 Chronicles 32, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 11, due to the threat of an Assyrian invasion and a siege by Sennacherib, Hezekiah, the king of Israel, commissioned the digging of a tunnel to divert water from a spring outside the walls of the city to a pool inside the city, indicated by the blue line in this picture. The curving tunnel is 533 meters long and ends up in the pool of Siloam. It's still there today and is in fact a very popular tourist attraction. Tourists who are prepared to get their legs or pants wet can walk the full length of the tunnel from the Gihon Spring to the pool of Siloam. Towards the end of the tunnel, an inscription was found on the wall in 1880, describing the digging of the tunnel. Unfortunately, the inscription was hacked out and ended up in a Turkish museum, but a replica has been installed by Israel in its place. Here's a closer picture of the replica. The sign above it says, "You are standing at the place where the Shiloh inscription, written approximately 2,700 years ago during the reign of King Hezekiah, was discovered." This is the original in the Turkish Museum, and it clearly confirms the biblical account of the digging of the tunnel during the time of Israel's occupation of the land 2,700 years ago. Added to this evidence of Israel's occupation of the land in biblical times could be numerous seals, tablets, and coins which bear the actual names of biblical characters referred to in the Bible. And we'll have a look at some of those later during this series.